heroes, villains, zombies, robots, dinosaurs, mushrooms? They're mushrooms, right? These are all examples of video game characters, and they're made by character artists.
Yeah.
A character artist's job involves sculpting, painting, studying anatomy. I mean, they could probably name all the millions of bones in a human body.
What do you mean there's only 206?
If any of this interests you, or if you just like the idea of putting a cool creature in a video game, then stay tuned. This video might be just for you. All right, let's roll. .3D character artists. They model, texture, and oftentimes design the characters that appear in a video game. But the role has more to it than just building a character in 3D. One of the hardest parts of being a character artist is capturing the fantasy of a character, even if the character is really tiny on screen, or only seen from above, or always whizzing around in a blur, or even if the only part of the character that you can see is their arms. So, how does a character artist even get started?
We get a concept, either from the concept artist or we make one. I see the concept as the final target I'm aiming for. When we bring the concept into 3D, we want to capture the iconic qualities of the concept and, if possible, even enhance them.
Oh, okay. So, if I took this concept of Garen, I could start to break it down to its most iconic elements. That would probably be his sword, his pauldrons, and his scarf. If we look at Garen's model in League of Legends, you can see that he's been already simplified down to these three basic elements because he's so small on screen. The only danger is losing the character's essence as you simplify them down to their core elements, or choosing the wrong core elements to simplify them down to. Like if we reduced Garen down to his boots, hands, and hair. And that's why character artists work very closely with concept artists to make sure they preserve the character's iconic traits. Okay, so how does the 3D modeling process actually start?
Our process generally starts with creating a quick proxy model, which just has big blocks of shapes and color. We use the proxy to check for key proportions and silhouette as soon as possible. We then make adjustments based on how the model looks in-game, continuing to push readability and adding detail and contrast to highlight the focal points.
Oh, okay, so the proxy is kind of like a 3D model that you can change really fast so that you can nail down the big picture. But wait, before we go any further, what is a 3D model? Oh wait, am I supposed to do this part? Okay, hold on. In most games, a 3D model is essentially a collection of points in 3D space called vertices. The vertices are connected to each other with line segments, forming polygons. These polygons form what is called a polygon mesh. And that's a 3D model. After the proxy model comes the high poly sculpt. This is where all the detail and polish comes into the model, and it's generally done using a digital sculpting platform, like ZBrush. Digital sculpting is a lot like sculpting with real clay, except super complicated. But don't worry, you can totally learn it, and this footage is sped up quite a bit. Let's see what sculpting looks like at normal speed. Okay, I think we get it. Let's move on.
Once your high poly sculpt is created in ZBrush, you have to optimize it into what's called a low poly mesh. The reason for this is that the game's engine calculates all the polygons on your model in real time, and on a high poly sculpt that can be millions of polys, which can really kill the game's performance and slow everything down. The low poly mesh is basically a simplified version of your sculpt, but with way fewer polys.
Wait. So we made a proxy model, which is a simplified version of the character, then a high poly sculpt, which is a highly detailed and polished version of the character, and now we're going back down to simplified again? Are we just gonna lose all those cool details?
Oh no!
Luckily, we can use something called a UV map and texture baking to preserve the details from the sculpt.
Creating a UV map is called unwrapping the model. A UV map is basically an image of the model's surface area. It's like unfolding a cardboard box or peeling an orange and laying the skin out flat. The next step in the process is projecting the high poly details onto the low poly mesh. We call this texture baking, which gets us all those details without adding any polys.
Whoa, and you can add color to your model by painting your UV map. This nightmare-inducing process is called texture painting. Okay, that's enough. An alternative to using purely hand-painted textures is using shaders to generate different colors, materials, and effects on your model. This is a much more technical approach, but can also be incredibly powerful. So let's watch a quick overview of how a shader works. Shaders are basically chunks of code, and they dictate how the surface of a model should look. Shaders generally have a lot of options and inputs. In this example, it has one for color, one for transparency, and one for how metallic it looks. So that means if we change the shader's color, it'll affect the color of the models. If we change the transparency slider, the models will become more see-through. Anyway, let's move on to the metallic slider, which will make the models look more reflective, giving them the appearance of metal. You can also connect images to the shader options. This is called applying a texture map. For instance, we can plug a checkerboard into the color input. But if we take that same checkerboard texture and plug it into the transparency channel, the checkerboard no longer controls the color, but rather the level of transparency. Alright, let's look at some other shader options and see how they can work together. Let's say we want to make these models look like they're made out of cracked rock. So the first thing we can do is apply a cracked rock texture map to the color channel. Next, we can apply a normal map. This funny-looking texture dictates how light will interact with the various details and bumps on the rock. Finally, we can apply a height map. This texture dictates how much various parts of the rock should stick out. Let's crank that up. Okay, too much. So you can see how just these three maps can work together to give the appearance of a rock. And remember, this is just a tiny preview of the kinds of things that shaders can do. So be sure to get out and research more about shaders if it's something you're interested in. Alright, so we've gone through a bunch of different things. First there was the proxy model, then the high poly sculpt, then the optimized low poly mesh, then the unwrapped UVs, the texture bake, the texture painting, we learned about shaders. There is a lot of technical stuff in character art. I'm still scared of just learning something like ZBrush.
While it may take a little while to learn a program like ZBrush at first, it's not really the main obstacle to becoming a good sculptor. The most important thing is to learn anatomy. In order to create a believable sculpt, you need to understand how the bones and muscles work, or the sculpt will end up looking pretty weird, and it may also be difficult to animate.
But what if I want to make like crazy creatures and stuff? How will real-life anatomy knowledge help me with that?
Once you really understand anatomy, you can bend the rules a bit to invent new creatures that are strange but still believable. You can take the anatomy of humans, birds, insects, and Frankenstein those together to make creatures that don't exist but still look really cool. Take Nunu as an example. We took the face of a lion, a bear's pelvis, we gave him 6 arms like an insect, and we combined it all together to make a pretty weird creature but still feels like a believable living beast.
Whoa! I should really study anatomy. That was way better than my version of Nunu. So in the concept art video, we talked a lot about how changes can occur during development. Are there any kind of last-minute changes that can happen to a character artist?
Sometimes we find that parts of our design that look great when the model is in neutral pose just don't work once the character is moving.
Things like colors, scarves, or armor designs can limit the animation possibilities, like if the character can't raise the arms without stopping their own face. We work with the tech artists and animators when this happens, to adjust the model so the animator can achieve the desired expression for the character.
Woo, we covered a lot in this one. But again, don't let the volume of stuff intimidate you. Everybody learns all this one little step at a time. All right, now it's time for some advice.
So one thing that I find difficult for some of the artists I work with is staying inspired. I still read comic books, I still get excited for comic book characters, all the Marvel movies, anime I still watch, cartoons with my kids all the time. So all that stuff still excites me, and I think it's just holding on to the things that excited me when I was young and still letting them inspire me today.
I would say what's really important and a fun thing to do is get involved with online art communities such as Polycount and ArtStation. If you use those sites, you can easily find people who inspire you and find people who you look up to, and you can try and emulate what they're doing in your own pieces.
Don't be fixating on the technical aspect. Try to cultivate more of an artistic vision and develop some new ideas, or like just ideas that come from your mind and come from your heart, the stuff that you're really interested in. And then you can just find reference, study nature, study the world around you. It will help you to understand how things work, and it will be making your creations much more compelling than they are now, probably. I don't know. It helps me as well.
I would say the most valuable thing that I've learned is to cut your goals up into smaller bite-sized chunks. Don't try to become the best character artist in one go. Figure out what it is that you want to achieve and approach it one tiny step at a time so that you can see your progress. And on top of that, one last thing, if it's not hard, you're not learning. So don't be afraid of struggling a little bit.